Now we're going to learn how to multiply radicals. Now, here, let me distribute the radical 5 to the inside. When it comes to a radical and a whole number, we cannot combine them. So radical 5 times 2, I'm just going to call that 2 radical 5. We cannot combine them, so I'm just going to write both of them. Now, radical 5 times radical 6, I'm going to call that radical 30. Radical times radical becomes a bigger radical. Now, radical 30, I cannot simplify. So that's basically it. Looking at example B, I'm going to write this as 4 times radical 12 minus 4 radical 27. If you can simplify a radical, please do so. Radical 12, I'm going to call that radical 4 times radical 3 because radical 4 is a whole number. Now looking at the outside, I have 4 times 2. So I'm going to call this 8 radical 3 minus, looking at my second radical, radical 27, I'm going to break that as the square root of 9 times the square root of 3. Because the square root of 9 is a perfect square. Looking at my big numbers outside, 4 times 3, I have 12 radical 3. Now I see these two have the same radical. So in the previous section, we learned that we can combine those. The outside numbers, I'm looking at 8 minus 12. So I'm going to call this negative 4 radical 3. Let me distribute that radical 5 to the second parentheses. Radical 5 times radical 6, that gives me radical 30. Radical 5 times 1, that gives me 1 radical 5. Right, the number on the outside, I'm choosing not to write it. Now let me distribute the 3. 3 times radical 6, I get 3 radical 6. 3 times 1, I get 3. None of my radicals can be simplified. None of them are like terms, so there's nothing I can combine. Let's do this one. Let me distribute the 7. 7 radical 5 plus 7 radical 2. Now let me distribute the negative radical 3. So I have negative radical 15 minus radical 6. None of them can be simplified. None of them are like terms, so I cannot combine anything. Take a look at this one. Let me distribute the radical 10. Radical 10 times radical 10 is radical 100. Minus radical 10 times radical 3 gives me radical 30. Now let me distribute the radical 3. Right, square root of 3 times square root of 10 gives me radical 30. And then radical 3 times the negative radical 3 give me negative, right? Plus times and minus. Positive times the negative, it's negative radical 9. Cool thing is that I see the center, they cancel out. Those are like terms. I'm looking at negative 1 plus 1, that's 0. So that goes away. Do not write it. Do not think that, well, it's 0. I'm just going to write radical 30 and not write anything on the front. Because if you do that, you're telling me there's a 1 in front of it. So you're telling me that negative 1 plus 1 is 1, which is not true. So don't write it. Now, my other radicals that I have, square root of 100 is 10. At the end, square root of 9 is 3. So I'm looking at 10 minus 3. So I'm going to call that 7. Beautiful. Now, the little squared on the outside, do not distribute the exponent to the inside because there is a plus sign in the center. Do not distribute it. What that little 2 on the outside means is you have the same parentheses twice. So if I have a 3, I'll have the same parentheses 3 times. Now let me distribute. Let me distribute the radical 7 to the second parentheses. Radical 7 times radical 7 gives me radical 49. Radical 7 times a negative 3, I get negative 3 radical 7. Now let me distribute the negative 3. Negative 3 times radical 7, I get negative 3 radical 7. And negative 3 times a negative 3 give me positive 9. Now, to begin with, radical 49, right? The square root of 49, that's 7. So when I'm looking at whole numbers, I'm looking at 7 plus 9. That's 16. When I'm looking at the radicals, they are like terms because they have the same radical. I'm going to combine the numbers on the outside. Negative 3 minus 3, I'm going to call this negative 6 radical 7. Let me work this one out. Let me distribute the 5 to the second parentheses. 5 times 5, that gives me 25. Times the cube root of 3, that gives me 5 cube root of 3. Remember, a whole number and a radical we cannot combine. Now, let me distribute this negative radical. Keep in mind I call it negative because of the negative sign in front of it. Negative cube root of 3 times 5 give me negative 5 cube root of 3. Now, negative cube root of 3 times a positive cube root of 3 give me a negative cube root of 9. The root, leave it at the same. I'll just multiply my numbers inside. 3 times 3, that gave me 9. Now, cool thing in here is the middle term cancels out. Those are like terms. 5 minus 5 is 0. So they go away. My last thing, cube root of 9, that's not a perfect cube. The square root of 9 is, but not the cube root. So I'm just going to write this as 25 minus the cube root of 9. Let me distribute the 2. 2 times 1 is 2. 2 times radical 5 is 2 radical 5. Let me distribute the radical 3. I have 1 radical 3 plus radical 15. Now, none of them can be simplified. None of them are like terms. That's it. Lastly, on this part, let me distribute the 4. 4 times 4 is 16. 4 times a negative radical 3 is negative 4 radical 3. Now let me distribute the radical 3. I have plus 4 radical 3 minus radical 9. The like terms in the center cancel out. Now at the end, I have minus the square root of 9. I'm just going to call that minus 3, right? Square root of 9 is 3. So I have 16 minus 3. I'm going to call that 13.